The ledger at Lock Haven Foundry I Inventory Ava Morales did numbers for a living because numbers didn't lie. They hid. There was a difference. When the nonprofit in Lock Haven hired her to audit the Employment Transition Fund attached to the old foundry redevelopment, they gave her a folding table, a rolling chair with 2 stubborn wheels, and a key to a storage room that smelled like metal and paper and family secrets. "It's all there," Walter from the county said, jangling optimism like keys. "Just needs organizing." The boxes were labeled in a dozen hands: ledger benefits, shift rosters by debt, community relief, pastor. A cardboard banker's box at the bottom of the stack had no label, just a single tally mark drawn with a carpenter's pencil. Ava set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside, a bound ledger with a red spine, the kind used by men who like their lies tidy. To the red spine. The first pages were ordinary: names, hours, rates, taxes. Then the pattern changed. Rows without names, just numbers where a name should be. Debits from the fund to community council, then to pastoral needs, then to a P.O. box that smelled like laundering. In the margin someone had written, "Small and patient, count again." Ava paged back to the start. The column headers were in 2 hands. The first, neat and formal, Fredericks, comptroller. The second, tight and slanted, R. Whitaker, night clerk. A note at the bottom of a page read, "If whistle changes pitch, re-add head count. See Sam's cards." 3. The whistle. At 7-Eleven, the old whistle at the paper mill across the river sounded the way a dog remembers a trick. 2 notes, a low and then a higher one, the second like a question. Ava, who had grown up in Florida where the air rehearsed heat, felt the sound in her molars and wrote in the margin, 2 notes again. She took the ledger to Ruth at the diner because Ruth had the kind of face that told you she already knew and would not make you perform surprise. "Red spine?" Ruth said, setting down pie. "That ledger made my mother sit with a cigarette by the sink for a decade." "What is it?" "Head count that didn't," Ruth said. "Men paid from a fund meant for women who lost one. Pastors who told us quiet was a kind of faith." She tapped the page. "You going to do something with that?" "I'm an auditor," Ava said. "I do math." "Then you're going to do something with it," Ruth said, and smiled in a way that meant you've already said yes to something you haven't named. Ivy Council. The community council met in a room that had once been a bank. The vault was now a playroom. The chairs were upholstered in plaid that pretended to be neutral. The men on the dais smiled the way chairs do when you sit where they didn't expect you to. Nolan Pike, chair, welcomed public comment. Walter stood at the back, hands in pockets, apology ready. Ava signed in. "I'm here about the transition fund," she said, "and the ledger that shows where it didn't go." She held up a photocopy of a page where names had been erased and generic entries written over them like frost. Nolan's smile cooled. "Those records are incomplete." "They're finished enough," Ava said. "They show people got paid to keep the lights on, while families were told to pray." She set the photocopy on the table the way you set down a dish that might be bad news. "I want the list of recipients." "Out of scope," Nolan said, polite like a blade. "Counting is always scope," Ava said. V. The night clerk. Back in the storage room, the air did that thing air does before a storm made a belly. Ava flipped to a page where the tight, slanted hand had drawn a tiny chair in the margin. The night clerk wrote to himself in code. Hum. 11. 14. Locked. Left key with blue string. She thought of houses and back rooms and women who tell you to bring sugar and not ask questions. The door to the storage room clicked. A man stood there in a work jacket, name stitched above the pocket. Sam. The letters were a little crooked. A mother's care. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "I'm auditing," Ava said, "because sometimes the truth is a shield you hope works against ghosts." "Who are you?" "Samuel when the foreman's mad," he said. "Sam if you're counting." He nodded at the ledger. "Count." 6 count. They did. Names where there should have been numbers, numbers where there should have been names. A column that should have balanced and didn't, no matter how you tried to be generous. The ledger told a story it didn't mean to. Men who worked dangerous jobs giving small money to a church that gave big silence to the women left with the bills. The fund had paid for someone's lake house and someone else's re-election, and a plaque in a hallway that didn't name the dead. Ava wrote a summary that said it plain. She sent it to the paper in Harrisburg and the one in Williamsport. She CC'd 3 women whose emails Ruth found in a binder labeled Garden Club. She taped a copy to the foundry door with blue painter's tape because sometimes you have to make your own bulletin board. 7. Keys. The council called her a thief. The pastor called her a liar. Walter called her late at night and said, "I wish I hadn't signed that memo in 77. And Ava said, "You did." And he said, "I know." Women stood in the storage room with her and shook their keys like a choir that had learned a new hymn. The whistle blew 2 notes. The second note sounded less like a question. Bade exit. They didn't fire her because the grant was federal and came with teeth, but they tried to make the room smaller. She brought in more chairs. They tried to say she had misunderstood the columns. She printed the index. They tried to say the ledger was a forgery. Sam stood behind her and nodded once, and somewhere a punch clock stamped 7:12 on a card that wasn't there before. When the story ran, the comments called her a saint and a witch and a girl who didn't understand hard work. The funds board resigned in a paragraph. The pastor took a leave to listen. Nolan did not resign, but he stopped saying scope like it belonged to him. Walter brought Ava a box with a folded county flag and the whistle from a child's train set, and set it on the table as if it could say what he couldn't. Ava put the red-spined ledger in a glass case in the lobby of the Resource Center with a placard. Community Accountability, Open Hours 9-5. She added beneath, handwritten, after 7 p.m. We keep counting. At night sometimes, when the river made the sound rivers make, when the bridges pretend not to worry, Ava heard the whistle ask and answer itself. She tapped her fingers on the table 1, 2, 3, 4 and opened the storage room door. "Operator," a voice would say, and Ava, who did not run switchboards but did run numbers, would answer, "Yes, I'm listening."